Your Honor, the defendant was caught trespassing in a government building. The young prosecutor said sharply, "A repeat, vagrant, a public nuisance." The old man standing at the defense table didn't flinch, didn't argue. He just lowered his head and clutched the worn dog tags hidden under his collar. No one in that courtroom cared. No one wondered why a man with boots older than the prosecutor himself had nowhere else to go during the freezing night. Until the judge read his name. And why did the judge's eyes suddenly fill with tears? Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The wind cut through downtown Boston like a knife, swirling frozen dust across the courthouse steps. Sarah Collins tucked her chin deeper into the scarf wrapped around her neck, the wool barely holding back the biting January chill. Another day, another docket of petty crimes, she thought, pushing through the heavy doors. Inside the courthouse hummed with the low murmur of routine misery. Lawyers shuffled papers. Defendants shifted uncomfortably in hard wooden chairs. Sarah had seen it all before: the tired faces, the indifference, the system grinding on. She checked her clipboard, flipping through a list of cases scheduled for the morning. Thomas Avery, she murmured under her breath, trespassing. No different than the dozen others who'd be processed and forgotten today. She barely glanced at the name as she moved toward her station. The defendant arrived under escort hands, loosely cuffed in front of him. Sarah noticed him mostly because of how still he was. Not defiant, not ashamed, just still. Thin, weathered man, perhaps late 60s, wrapped in a battered green coat. His beard was silver and tangled, his boots cracked and dusted with city grime. Tom Avery. He shuffled forward without resistance, his breath visible in the icy air that seemed to cling to him, as if even the courthouse's meager warmth hadn't reached him yet. Sarah scribbled something on her clipboard and glanced at the incident report. Trespassing, a closed public library, 3:12 a.m., temperature outside, 12 degrees Fahrenheit. He hadn't broken anything, hadn't stolen anything. He just found a door left ajar and curled up behind the information desk, trying to survive another night. The arresting officer's notes were curt. Subject found asleep inside, cooperative. Sarah frowned. She'd seen her share of shoplifters, vagrants, even violent offenders, but there was something about Tom Avery that didn't fit the usual mold. Maybe it was the dog tags that clinked softly against his chest as he moved. Maybe it was the quiet dignity in his posture even now. The courtroom slowly filled. Judge Daniel Whitaker entered without ceremony, his black robes flaring slightly as he moved briskly to the bench. Sarah watched him settle in glasses, perched low on his nose, scanning the docket. Case number 2947, the clerk announced, Commonwealth versus Thomas Eugene. Avery, charged trespassing. Tom stepped forward. The prosecutor, a young man with slicked back hair and too much confidence, launched into a dry recitation of facts. Your Honor, the defendant was apprehended inside the Boston Public Library after hours. Prior record includes minor citations for loitering, no violent offenses. Judge Whitaker barely looked up. Mr. Avery, how do you plead? Tom's voice was hoarse but clear. Guilty, Your Honor. The words barely carried across the room, but Sarah heard them. She heard something else too. A resignation that went deeper than a simple guilty plea. The judge flipped through the thin file, his brow furrowing slightly. Then he paused. His eyes settled on a page. He leaned closer, adjusted his glasses. Sarah watched a strange stillness settle over him. Thomas Eugene Avery. Judge Whitaker repeated slowly, almost to himself. He turned the page, scanned something quickly, then turned back. His hands, Sarah noticed, trembled slightly as he gripped the file folder. Something was happening, the prosecutor, oblivious, continued. Given the circumstances, the Commonwealth recommends time served and release with a warning. Judge Whitaker didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained locked on Tom, who stood motionless, his head slightly bowed. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. The energy in the room had changed subtly but unmistakably. It was as if a current of electricity had passed through the old creaking beams overhead. Finally, the judge spoke. His voice was rougher than usual. Court will recess for 15 minutes, he announced abruptly. Bailiff, escort Mr. Avery to the holding area. The prosecutor blinked. So did Sarah. This wasn't normal procedure for a simple trespassing case. The bailiff gently guided Tom away. He didn't resist. He didn't even seem curious. Just moved as directed, his footsteps soft against the worn floor. Sarah remained at her post, but her eyes followed the judge as he rose and disappeared into his chambers. And though she couldn't explain why, a knot of unease had settled in her chest. Outside, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the city in white. Inside, something unseen had been stirred, something that would soon break through the ice, not just in the courtroom, but in every heart that bore witness. Sarah hugged her clipboard tighter to her chest. She had a feeling that today was going to be different. Sarah stayed at her post, pretending to organize papers as the courtroom slowly emptied for recess, but her eyes kept darting toward the heavy oak door leading to Judge Whitaker's chambers. Something about the way he had reacted, about the way he had said the name, still tugged at her gut. Judges didn't usually tremble. They didn't usually call a recess over a homeless man caught sleeping in a library. Unless it wasn't just a homeless man. She tightened her grip on the clipboard, her fingers fidgeting at the edges. In the holding area down the hall, she caught a glimpse of Tom Avery sitting quietly on a bench, wrists still loosely cuffed. He wasn't pleading, arguing, or even speaking. He just sat there, his head bowed, as if the weight of the world pressed down on his thin shoulders. A ghost, she thought, a man already halfway faded from a world too busy to remember him. The minutes ticked by, and behind the thick door, Judge Whitaker wasn't wasting time. Inside his chambers, Daniel Whitaker locked the door and leaned heavily against it for a moment, his breath visible in the cold air from the drafty old building. His fingers trembled as he reached for a locked drawer in his desk. The key slid into the lock with a soft click. Inside, wrapped carefully in an aging manila envelope, lay a single photograph. A moment frozen in time. A dusty field hospital somewhere outside Fallujah, Iraq. 2004. A group of exhausted soldiers, dust and blood smeared across their faces. And in the back row, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a crooked grin, arms slung around two younger soldiers like a protective shield. Daniel's younger self was in that picture, barely 20 years old, standing stiffly to one side, awkward and raw, and next to him, Tom Avery. Only back then, everyone just called him Sarge. Whitaker's heart hammered against his ribs. He remembered it vividly now. The ambush on the convoy, the screams, the fire, the way Sarge had run through gunfire to haul wounded men out of the burning trucks. How he had thrown Daniel over his shoulder like a sack of flour and carried him 2 miles through sniper fire to the medevac site. Daniel remembered lying on the ground, blood pooling in his boot, hearing a voice growl in his ear. "Keep breathing, kid. Your story's not over yet." He hadn't known then if he would survive. He hadn't known the man's real name. Only a barked Avery, move shouted by some officer before everything went black. And now, 20 years later, that same man sat in his courtroom, arrested for nothing more than trying not to die of cold. Daniel swore under his breath and sat down hard in the old leather chair behind his desk. He booted up the secured laptop he rarely used anymore, tapping into a database only accessible to court officers working veteran liaison cases. It didn't take long to find it. Thomas Eugene Avery, United States Army Service. Years 1982, 2000, more rank staff sergeant. Commendations: Bronze Star for Valor, Purple Heart, Army Commendation Medal with Valor Device Deployment, Iraq, 2003-2004, Afghanistan. Multiple tours, a highly decorated soldier, a hero, and yet there it was in the public notes. Status: discharged honorably, residence unknown, medical not receiving benefits, status paperwork incomplete after wife's death, pension terminated, 2008, address unconfirmed. Daniel's chest tightened. It wasn't that Tom Avery had disappeared. It was that no one had bothered to keep looking. A knock sounded at his door. His clerk, no doubt. He ignored it. Instead, he picked up the phone and made a call. He hadn't made in over a decade. The line rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Colonel Samuel Brooks, who's calling?" Daniel swallowed Sam. "It's Danny Whitaker." A beat of stunned silence. Then Danny Judge. "Danny Whitaker." "Damn, it's been years." "What's wrong?" "I found him, Sam." Daniel said, his voice breaking slightly. "I found Sarge." Another silence. This one heavier. Where the colonel asked, his voice dropping low. "In my courtroom, homeless facing trespassing charges." A long, raw exhale on the other end. "You don't let him out of your sight," Sam said firmly. "I'm getting in the car. I'll be there before lunch." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Relief and guilt tangled inside him like twin storms. When he hung up, he sat back staring at the faded photograph still trembling in his hands. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside the courthouse, the world kept spinning forward as if nothing had changed. But Sarah knew. Something had changed. She glanced at Tom again through the holding cell glass. How he sat there, a ghost wearing dog tags, forgotten by the very people he had once protected. Sarah pressed a hand lightly over her heart, feeling the quiet ache spreading inside her. The system hadn't seen him. The city hadn't seen him. But today, for the first time in years, someone did, and sometimes one pair of open eyes was all it took to start a revolution. The 15-minute recess ticked past like a slow drumbeat. Sarah stood behind her station, heart pounding harder than it should for a trespassing case. Across the room, Tom Avery sat again at the defense table, shoulders slumped but composed, the same dog tags glinting faintly under the fluorescent lights. His coat still clung to him like a second skin, dusted with flecks of snow that hadn't yet melted. When the heavy oak door creaked open, every head turned instinctively. Judge Daniel Whitaker stepped back into the courtroom, face-lined expression unreadable. But Sarah noticed it immediately. The stiffness in his posture was gone, replaced by something else. Resolved, the bailiff called the room to order. Everyone rose, and for the first time since Sarah had worked here, she sensed a ripple of uncertainty among the court staff. As if they too could feel the shift under the surface, Judge Whitaker adjusted his robes and spoke directly to the bailiff. "Please allow seating for our distinguished visitors," he said, voice steady but thick. Visitors, Sarah turned, and that's when she saw them. Three men standing at the back of the courtroom. Uniforms crisp, medals gleaming under the harsh lights. One of them, a tall, square-jawed man in full-dress blues, caught Sarah's gaze and gave a brief nod before stepping forward. Colonel Samuel Brooks, his presence alone silenced the casual murmurs in the gallery. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably at his table, clearly sensing this wasn't going to be an ordinary proceeding. "Proceed," Judge Whitaker said, tapping the gavel once. Colonel Brooks approached the stand with the measured, unflinching steps of someone who had walked through worse than courtroom scrutiny. He raised his right hand, was sworn in, and took his seat. The courtroom held its breath. Brooks spoke without hesitation. "My name is Colonel Samuel Brooks. United States Army, active duty. I served with Staff Sergeant Thomas Avery during Operation Iraqi Freedom." Sarah felt the air in the room change, a tangible shift, like the pressure before a storm. Brooks continued, his voice resonating with the weight of years carried quietly. "In April 2004, our convoy was ambushed outside Fallujah. Heavy fire. Multiple casualties. Staff Sergeant Avery, despite sustaining injuries himself, personally rescued 17 soldiers from burning vehicles, including a young medic named Private First Class Daniel Whitaker." Heads turned sharply toward the judge. Whitaker didn't move, his hands folded tightly before him, knuckles white, the colonel went on. "Staff Sergeant Avery carried PFC Whitaker 2 miles under hostile fire to reach an extraction point. He refused medical attention until every wounded soldier had been evacuated." Sarah blinked hard, the words landing like stones in the silence. This wasn't just a homeless man. This was a hero who had carried life on his back through hell and now sat in a Boston courtroom, accused of trespassing for trying not to die from the cold. Brooks placed a folder on the witness stand. "I have here verified records of Avery's service, his commendations, and a letter from General Matthew Clayton, commander of the 3rd Infantry Division, confirming his acts of valor." The prosecutor rose shakily. "Your Honor, while the defendant's military service is commendable." "The charge at hand," Judge Whitaker held up a hand. "Sit down," he said quietly. The young lawyer obeyed without another word. Sarah barely breathed. Judge Whitaker turned to Tom Avery, his voice softer now. "Avery," he said, "would you approach the bench?" Tom hesitated, confusion flickering across his weathered features. Slowly he rose, his every movement cautious, uncertain. He stopped before the bench, standing straight, despite the years and hardships etched into his frame. Judge Whitaker removed his glasses and looked at Tom. Really looked at him for the first time. "I owe you my life," he said, voice cracking the thin veil of judicial decorum. "I never knew your full name." "Only Sarge," shouted across smoke and chaos. "I spent 20 years looking for you." The courtroom blurred around Sarah. She blinked fast, willing herself not to cry. Tom. Avery, for his part, seemed stunned into still stillness. He opened his mouth, then closed it, then finally rasped, "I was just doing my job, sir." A long, heavy pause stretched out. Judge Whitaker drew a deep breath and addressed the court. "In light of extraordinary circumstances, and in recognition of the defendant's extraordinary service to this nation, this court moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Avery." With prejudice, the gavel fell once sharp. Final, a sound like a heartbeat resuming after too long without breath. The courtroom didn't erupt into cheers, it didn't need to. The silence itself was louder than any applause could ever have been. Tom staggered back a step as if the words physically struck him. The bailiff moved toward him instinctively, But Judge Whitaker held up a hand. "Let him be," he said gently. Colonel Brooks rose from the stand, crossed the floor, and without hesitation, without caring who watched, extended his hand to Tom. Avery, Tom took it slowly, awkwardly, like a man unaccustomed to being seen anymore. And when their hands clasped, the room, lawyers, clerks, visitors, even reporters rose to their feet, one by one. Sarah stood too, heart hammering in her chest, blinking back tears she couldn't explain. It wasn't just respect, it was gratitude. It was regret. It was the acknowledgement of a debt that could never fully be repaid, Tom. Avery stood there bewildered, overwhelmed the thin silver chain of his dog, tags catching the light like a forgotten medal, finally being noticed. For the first time in years, he wasn't invisible, he was seen. And Sarah knew deep down in her bones, today justice hadn't just been served. It had remembered, the room remained standing long after the gavel had fallen. Tom Avery stood in the center of it all, not moving, not speaking, like a man who'd wandered accidentally into someone else's dream. Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. She had seen acquittals before, reversals, even rare moments of mercy, but never anything like this. Never a room full of strangers rising in silent tribute to a man they had been trained all their lives to overlook. Judge Whitaker leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Avery, you are free to go," he said. "But before you leave, there are some matters that need to be made right." The judge nodded once to Colonel Brooks, who in turn gestured toward the side door. Sarah followed with her eyes as Tom, still dazed, was guided gently away. Not by handcuffs, not by force, but by a man who once owed him his very life. Outside the courtroom, the world was waiting. A wall of reporters pressed forward, cameras, flashing microphones thrust into the cold morning air. Questions flew like a hailstorm. "Mr. Avery, how do you feel? Will you be suing the city? How long were you homeless? Why didn't you ask for help?" Tom flinched instinctively from the attention, raising a hand as if to shield himself. Colonel Brooks stepped between him and the cameras, voice firm but polite. "No comment. Today, give the man some dignity." Sarah, watching through the glass, felt a strange mixture of pride and shame. Pride that people finally cared. Shame that it had taken this long. Within hours, the story exploded across local news and social media. The headlines were brutal in their honesty. Decorated war hero, found sleeping in library veteran, saved lives overseas, forgotten at home. From battlefield to back alley. How America failed, Sergeant Avery. People who had never spared a second thought for the homeless man hunched under the library awning were suddenly outraged, moved, guilt-ridden donations flooded in veterans groups mobilized. A prominent nonprofit announced they would cover temporary housing, counseling, and full legal services for Tom Avery. By the next morning, a GoFundMe page created by a stranger had raised over $150,000. Sarah sat at her desk, scrolling through the updates, her heart tight, but she knew the money wasn't the point. The point was that for the first time in a very long time, Tom Avery wasn't invisible. 2 days later, a press conference was hastily arranged on the courthouse steps. Tom stood stiffly at the podium, a new jacket draped over his gaunt frame, his beard trimmed but still wild around the edges. He held a small stack of notes in one hand, but when he spoke, he didn't use them. His voice was steady, clear, not loud, but somehow it filled the space around him. "I don't want pity," Tom began, eyes sweeping over the gathered crowd. "And I don't want anger either." He paused, swallowing hard. "I want people to remember that the uniform doesn't come off when the service ends. The battle doesn't always stop when the bullets do. Some of us carry it home. Some of us get lost along the way." Sarah found herself holding her breath. "And if you see someone like me sitting on a corner, sleeping in a doorway." He looked down for a moment, then up again, voice roughening with emotion. "Don't just walk past, don't just assume. You might be passing by someone who once carried a brother to safety, someone who once stood between danger and a stranger they'd never met." He let the words hang in the frigid air, unpolished but devastatingly real. A hush fell over the reporters. Even the cameras seemed to pause. Tom stepped back, nodding once toward the veterans standing proudly behind him, men who had come out of the woodwork, uniforms dusted off just to bear witness. He didn't stay for interviews. He didn't seek applause. He simply walked down the courthouse steps, head high, back straight through the crowd that now parted for him without hesitation. And for the first time, people didn't look through him. They looked at him. Sarah watched it all unfold from the doorway, her hands trembling slightly. The world had finally seen Tom Avery, and maybe, just maybe, they would start seeing the others too. Winter didn't leave Boston easily that year. Even as February melted into March, the air still carried a knife's-edge chill, and the sidewalks remained rimmed with dirty snowbanks. But for the first time in years, Tom Avery wasn't fighting the cold alone. Sarah knew because she was there standing quietly across the street the morning Tom moved into Veterans Haven. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, a squat brick building with peeling paint and a battered flagpole. But inside it was warm, safe. And for Tom, it was something more than shelter. It was a beginning. The staff had given him the keys to a small one-bedroom unit on the third floor, fresh linens on the bed, a chipped wooden table by the window, a framed American flag hanging above the modest kitchenette. Tom stood in the doorway for a long moment, clutching the keys so tightly that Sarah worried they might snap. He stepped inside with the careful reverence of a man entering sacred ground. Sarah lingered in the hall, not wanting to intrude, but not willing to leave just yet either. Through the open door, she saw Tom move around the apartment, slowly, almost hesitantly. He ran a hand over the back of a worn armchair, as if testing whether it was real. He opened a cabinet, closed it again, checked the water in the tap, blinking when it ran clear and warm. Finally, he pulled something from the inner pocket of his coat, a small battered photograph. The edges frayed. The colors faded almost to nothing. Sarah recognized it even from a distance. A woman with laughing eyes standing barefoot on a grassy lawn. Margaret Tom placed the photograph carefully on the nightstand next to a battered set of dog tags and a small Bible, whose leather cover had seen better days. Then, still wearing his coat boots and layers of worn sweaters, Tom sat down on the bed. He didn't cry. He didn't collapse. He just sat there, breathing steady, present, alive. In the weeks that followed, the city seemed determined to make amends in the only ways it knew how. A veterans legal defense group helped Tom file for the benefits he had been denied for over a decade. The paperwork was a labyrinth, but with persistence, they cut through it. Within a month, Tom began receiving his full pension again, along with a lump sum payment covering years of unpaid support. He didn't spend the money wildly. He bought a new jacket, a proper pair of boots, a small laptop so he could write letters, not emails, but real letters to the men he had once served alongside. He declined interviews, turning down every flashy offer that came his way. But when the local high school invited him to speak to their history class, he said yes. Sarah went sitting quietly in the back row as Tom stood before a room full of restless teenagers. No fancy speeches, no dramatics. Just the truth. I'm not special, Tom told them. Voice low, but unwavering. I just kept going when it would have been easier to stop. And sometimes that's all it takes to change someone else's life. At the end of the talk, one boy, maybe 15, maybe 16, raised his hand and asked the question that hung unspoken in every heart. Were you angry that nobody helped you sooner? Tom paused. Sarah watched him closely, wondering how he would answer. He gave a small, tired smile. I was, he admitted, for a long time angry at the system. Angry at the people who looked away. He looked down for a moment, fingers brushing the dog tags he still wore under his shirt. But anger's a heavy thing to carry, and after a while it wears you down worse than the cold ever could. He raised his eyes again, and there was something shining there, something fierce and steady. So I let it go. Not because they deserved it, but because I deserved peace. The room was silent. Not the awkward silence of boredom. The heavy, aching silence of understanding. Later that day, Sarah found herself sitting with Tom on a bench outside the courthouse, the same place he had once slept curled against the stone to escape the wind. Now he sat tall, clean-shaven, jacket zipped up against the lingering chill, a quiet dignity about him that no hardship had ever managed to strip away. They didn't speak much, just watched as the afternoon sun turned the courthouse windows into sheets of gold. Finally, Tom broke the silence. Funny thing, he said, voice almost lost in the breeze. For years, I thought I was invisible. Turns out I just needed someone to see me. Sarah smiled, her throat too tight to speak. He turned to her, then his gaze steady. Thank you, Sarah, he said simply, for seeing me, and somehow that was enough. No fanfare, no dramatic speeches. Just two people sitting quietly, bearing witness to a life that had mattered all along, even when no one had noticed. Even when the world had looked away, spring crept into Boston with hesitant steps. The stubborn chill finally gave way to softer winds, and the sidewalks once rimmed with ice bloomed into narrow rivers of melted snow. Trees stretched tentative buds toward the warming sun. The world moved forward, and so did Tom Avery. It wasn't easy. Healing never was. Some nights, Sarah knew Tom still sat up long past midnight, staring at the ceiling of his tiny apartment, fighting battles no one else could see. Some wounds healed slower than others. Some never fully closed, but Tom kept moving, one breath at a time, one morning at a time. On Memorial Day, the city hosted a public ceremony at the Soldiers Plaza downtown, a sprawling square edged by marble monuments and weathered bronze statues. Sarah wasn't sure if Tom would come. He hadn't made any promises. But when the clock struck 10, there he was stepping out of the crowd dressed in a simple but immaculate dress uniform. It hung looser on his frame than it once had, but it carried the same quiet power. The bronze star pinned over his heart, the purple heart shining on his chest, and those dog tags always. Those dog tags tucked neatly into his collar. Sarah felt her chest tighten as she watched him walk toward the center of the plaza, not limping, not hiding, standing tall as the ceremony began. A hush fell over the square. The mayor spoke first, a polished, practiced speech about service and sacrifice. Then the commander of the local VFW post read the names of the fallen. When he finished, the microphone sat empty for a long moment, until Judge Daniel Whitaker, dressed not in robes but in simple civilian clothes, stepped forward. He cleared his throat, voice carrying across the silent crowd. Today, Whitaker said, we honor not just the ones who fell, but the ones who carried others through the fire and kept on walking. He turned, extending a hand toward Tom. Staff Sergeant Thomas Eugene. Avery, would you join me? Sarah's heart leapt. The crowd parted naturally, reverently. Tom stepped forward, boots clicking softly against the stone, and took his place beside the judge. Whitaker didn't need to say more. The honor guard presented arms. A bugler lifted his trumpet to his lips, the first mournful notes of taps soaring into the spring air. And slowly as one, the entire plaza, hundreds of people rose to their feet, saluting, standing, bearing. Witness Sarah stood too, blinking back tears. It wasn't just for Tom. It was for every man and woman who had once come home and found no one waiting, for every sacrifice unnoticed, for every silent hero buried by time and indifference. Today, just for today, they were all seen. After the ceremony, Tom lingered by the largest monument, a towering statue of a soldier carrying a wounded comrade across his shoulders. He stared up at it for a long time, expression unreadable. Sarah approached quietly, not wanting to disturb whatever was happening inside him. He noticed her anyway. You know, Tom said, voice low but steady, I used to think being invisible was easier. Less to lose, less to disappoint. He paused, tracing the outline of the names carved into the stone with one calloused fingertip. But it's not. He said softly, we're not meant to disappear. Sarah swallowed hard. No, sir, she whispered. You're not. Tom smiled then, a small, weary smile, but real. For the first time since she had met him, Sarah saw something else behind his eyes. Hope, not the wild roaring, hope of a man charging into battle, the quiet, stubborn hope of a man who had every reason to give up. But hadn't a hope that knew the world was broken, unfair, slow to remember, but also knew that sometimes it could still choose to do better. That evening, a new plaque was installed near the monument, a simple bronze plate, understated but impossible to miss. It read, in honor of all who served and all who were forgotten. No hero should ever be invisible. Dedicated to staff, Sergeant Thomas Eugene Avery. Avery and all like him. Sarah ran her fingers lightly over the cold metal, letting the words settle into her heart. Around her, the city buzzed on traffic, blaring phones, chirping, lives rushing forward. But here in this small corner of stone and memory, time slowed. History stood still. And Tom Avery's story, once nearly lost, was carved forever into the bones of the place he had fought to protect. She turned to find him standing a few steps behind her, his hands in his pockets. Gaze steady, their eyes met, and without a word, Sarah knew. Tom Avery would never be invisible again. Not here, not ever. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes, that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.